Hi everybody, my name is Catherine and this is my presentation on Jean Cocteau for queer cinema. May film remain film and none of its images be capable of translation into any language other than the dead language of the image. May cinegraphic star still exercise the fascination of a dead star whose pulse of light reaches mankind long after it was emitted. And may the audience for cinematography remain an audience hypnotized by these forces from beyond the grave. These words are said by Jean Cocteau, a French artist who was highly influential in each field he participated in, from poetry and literature to the theater to the world of filmmaking. One of the reasons we remain as an audience so hypnotized by Cocteau and his works is because of his influence as a queer filmmaker. I argue that Jean Cocteau's life as a queer man and his works as a queer filmmaker mirror one another, especially in the sense that both of these facets of his life work to portray a very uniquely queer mix of both camp and tragedy. Jean Cocteau was born in 1889 in France. His father, Georges Cocteau, was also an artist, and he was the one that taught Jean Cocteau to paint, and they would often paint together. Unfortunately, his father committed suicide when Jean was just 10, which left him with his mother, Eugenie. Eugenie was also very involved in the art world, and especially the theater world. Unfortunately, their bond was quite cold and emotionally distant, especially after his father's death, which I'll later argue is something that carries on into Jean Cocteau's romantic relationships. Still, because his mother was so ensconced within the theater world, Jean Cocteau also found a basis here and was able to meet a lot of different French artists. Initially, he became well known in the community because of his poetry, but then he branched into various forms of theater, writing and directing various plays that were pretty well renowned at the time and even today. Eventually, he moved into to literature rather, with his 1928 novel Le Livre Blanc, which is also translated to The White Book or The White Paper. This novel was really inspired by one of Jean Cocteau's lovers, Jean Desbordes, who just inspired him to really write this novel. And The White Paper is a book about a account of what homosexuality is like in France in the 1920s. It's very autobiographical, very personal, very genuine, and even explicit, which is, of course, very impactful for queer representation in queer literature. And one of the interesting things about it is that not only was Cocteau able to write and publish this explicitly queer novel at the time, but he also didn't shy away from the fact that it was him that wrote it and that he himself was queer. He published it anonymously to save his mother's reputation, basically. But he would sign copies for his friends, and he was very vocal about having written the book. And throughout his life, he was very vocal about being queer and about being a queer man and a queer artist, which is super important. He later, the next year, would write Les Enfants Terribles, or The Holy Terrors, which is a book where two children grow up in isolation, and then outside societal pressure results in their dual suicide, which is a theme we've seen often in queer cinema in the movies we've watched in this class. He, after writing his novels, then moved into filmmaking and experimented with film as a way to express poetry. His first film was in 1930, Le Sang de Poète, Blood of a Poet, and this is about a poet's connections to love and death. It's pretty experimental. A lot of his films are very experimental. Later, his 1950 film, Orphée, is a modern, in his day, modern retelling of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. So you can see that there. And then his last film would be Le Testament d'Orphée of 1960, which is about an aging poet who travels through time and kind of looks back at his life and the works that he's created. So you can see how they are, all of these films, especially the last, are quite autobiographical. These three films in particular form something called the Orphic Trilogy. They're a trilogy of films and often regarded as some of his masterpieces. And they are very autobiographical, and in many ways, they're very tragic. A lot of this tragedy, as I mentioned earlier, stems from his own personal life and his own personal relationships. His difficult connections he formed with his parents really set a foundation for having unfulfilling relationships with lovers later in life. One of his lovers, Raymond Laurent, shot himself after they had been together. In another instance, Jean Cocteau fell in love with an actress named Madeleine Carlier, who became pregnant, and he proposed to her and wanted to marry her, but she denied his advances and got an abortion. So then he moved on to a boy named Raymond Rodriguez, who was 15 years old. This is something, again, we've seen quite often, and the sources vary on whether Cocteau and Rodriguez were engaged in an actual relationship or if it was much more one-sided, where Cocteau had a sort of fascination and obsession with this boy. Either way, they were close friends, even if Cocteau sort of had his heart broken by Rodriguez's decline because he was straight. And so even though Cocteau had been rebuffed in this way, they stayed very close friends, but Rodriguez died just 5 years later of typhoid fever. So even the relationships that seemed to go well for Cocteau end in some form of tragedy or misfortune. In 1937, Cocteau met Jean Marais, who was an actor in many of his films, including in Orphée and in La Belle et la Bête, which we'll discuss later. These two were intermittent lovers until Cocteau's death, and their relationship seems quite happy, but even so, that can't take away from Cocteau's life of tragedy and of pain that he experienced. In many ways, I argue that this tragedy and this pain is reflected in his 1946 film La Belle et la Bête, or Beauty and the Beast. A unique thing about the tragedy of La Belle et la Bête is that it seems to be a uniquely queer tragedy specifically. Not to get into too much or spoil anything about the movie, but the movie does center around an unconventional, unmainstream form of attraction between beautiful Belle and the Beast, this hideous, deformed monster. It's the ways in which these two characters, but especially the Beast, who works as a surrogate for both Cocteau and a queer audience, it's the way that these two characters have to change for the so-called happy ending of the movie to occur that makes it not such a happy ending after all. In reality, Cocteau is making an interesting point about how society treats queer relationships and how these individuals have to change to be happy, resulting in a happiness that isn't so pure. Something that's truly fascinating to me, and that's very opposite from the tragedy of La Belle et la Bête, is the way that it's also an outstanding example of camp. Very opposite ideas. Susan Sontag in Notes on Camp even explicitly singles out Jean Cocteau, stating that his personality and many of his works are clear examples of camp. I mean, all you have to do is look at the overall style of the movie and those costumes, and it becomes pretty clear that she's right and the movie is camp. I argue that the statues in the film serve as a more specific example of this campy nature. Jean Cocteau uses statues in many of his films, including in the Orphic Trilogy, and to me they really serve as an aesthetic, hallmark of his works as an artist, and especially as a filmmaker. You can see here that the statues that frame the fireplace in the film become sort of statues in quotation marks once they gain human features and look around at the other characters, which fits perfectly into what Sontag said about camp treating objects as if they are in quotation marks. Her argument that camp also favors objects that aren't quite right or have a certain offness to them can be seen in these candle holders, quote unquote, which are really made of statues of human arms. These are supposed to be quite serious in the film and even rile up the tension of the film, but in reality, they just seem so over the top that the dramatics fall flat into a sort of comedy. This is perfect camp. This movie is perfect camp. A movie that takes itself and proposes itself so seriously, but can't be taken altogether that seriously because it is simply too much. In his book, The Art of Cinema, Jean Cocteau wrote, "The poet is like the dead in the sense that he walks invisibly among the living and is only imprecisely seen by them after his death. That is to say, in the case of the dead, when they appear in the form of ghosts." Jean Cocteau died in 1963. He is long a ghost, and we can only hope to imprecisely see him in his works now that he is gone. In my own imprecise analysis of Jean Cocteau's life as a queer artist and his films as a queer filmmaker, I argue that the reason he is truly important is because his life and works both serve to exhibit a tragedy and a camp that is uniquely and inherently queer. Thanks, guys.